What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. Today I'm going to be tackling the career of Francis Ford Coppola, including a ranking of every single feature film that he's ever made, with Megalopolis right around the corner, about to premiere at the Cannes Film Festival, or Cannes Film Festival, and also having recently unveiled a trailer, or basically it's a scene with Adam Driver poking his head out of a building. But I figured it was time to address some of my blind spots that I've been ignoring for many, many years. I had a lot of his films still on my to-do list, but also I needed to hunt down some of the alternative cuts to a lot of the films where I've seen them many times, and I definitely have versions that I prefer, but with so many versions out there for The Cotton Club or for The Outsiders or for Apocalypse Now, I needed to do a little homework before I could do a proper ranking list. But what I'm going to try to avoid with this video is just regurgitating everything that I recently learned while reading The Path to Paradise by Sam Wasson. If you're interested in film history, Sam Wasson writes film history with lightning bolts. At least so far, it seems like he's mostly preoccupied with the late 60s through like the early 80s. He just really loves that period. And if you're looking for another book, The Big Goodbye is all about the making of Chinatown, and it sounds like people are trying to make just the making of Chinatown into a feature film. It's written... Basically, he writes film history as if it were a best-selling novel or a page-turner, which obviously lends itself to the life of Francis Ford Coppola, because I think of all the filmmakers in the last half-century, he's probably had the most operatic career. And what I mean by that is the greatest heights, the lowest lows, like the greatest indignities, the greatest triumphs. But rather than cover his entire life, what the book mostly covers is the initial rise and fall of American zoetrope in the late 60s, followed by the even more glorious rise and the even more dramatic fall of American zoetrope all over again through the film One from the Heart. Now, as is usually the case when I'm making one of these videos about a giant filmography, I got way too carried away with the research because there's so many great documentaries out there about Francis Ford Coppola. I mean, just start with Hearts of Darkness, A Filmmaker's Apocalypse. The fact that that movie even exists is such a rare, unique resource where a filmmaker at the height of their powers, at the peak of their ability to make whatever movie they want to make, and you've got his wife, Eleanor Coppola, rest in peace, she recently died, filming him every step of the way, allowing us the privilege of going insane right alongside Coppola and all of his crew and all of his cast. But you could easily devote years upon years to studying Francis Ford Coppola. It's hard for me to figure out, where do I stop? And I finally realized there's no stopping point. You're just going to keep talking about Coppola for the rest of the year, because once Megalopolis comes out, we're going to be talking about him. And at the end of the year, when we're ranking all of our movies, we're going to be talking about him. So I feel like now I'm well prepared to discuss Coppola for the rest of the year. But last night I started writing an intro to this video, and I suddenly realized I couldn't stop. I just kept going and going. I was like, oh my God. I was like, you're not allowed to do any more homework. You're not allowed to do any more writing. You just got to start recording, or this video will never get made. And anything that doesn't make it into this video, I'll just save it for future videos on Coppola, because this year might be the last year where we get to discuss Coppola as an active, living filmmaker who's still part of the filmmaking scene. And I heard a really sad comment by him. Actually, it was attributed to him by Sam Wasson in his interview with Bret Easton Ellis. But he said Coppola's biggest regret is that he didn't leave the film industry in better shape than when he found it. Sometimes he's described himself as he's not the first of the new guys of the new Hollywood. He regards himself as the last of the old guys, basically the guys who were huge in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He was the last kind of titan, or the last real visionary from that time, right before the late 60s and early 70s and the new Hollywood took over. But here I would break ranks with Francis Ford Coppola, because I feel like the example that he set in the 1970s with his achievements, and then obviously he's made subsequent movies that I really enjoy, but in the 1970s he was the king. But I feel like that example that he set, it'll inspire novelists and filmmakers and storytellers of any shape or size for many, many decades to come. So I do feel like he left the industry in better shape than he found it. And he's only one man. It's not like he can, mount a one-man revolution. And when you look at all the filmmakers that got their start working with him and all the family members that went on to greater careers, I do think he left the film industry in better shape than when he found it. He's one of those rare filmmakers where he has lived a life of 100 men. And there are only really a handful of filmmakers like that, where their life is so fascinating. It takes on these dimensions where their life is more interesting sometimes even than the movies that they're making. And in that club, I would include people like Werner Herzog. A lot of people see the documentary Burden of Dreams before they even bother watching Fitzcarraldo, because they just want to see Werner Herzog going into the jungle and going insane. Or if you're like me and you really like Orson Welles, watching his movies is only the first step, the first baby steps in a lifelong obsession with his life and his career, in radio and on the stage. I mean, everything that he did. Orson Welles made many good movies, but his life is just absolutely riveting to study. And Francis Ford Coppola, he is definitely one of these legendary figures. And what I'm going to say is going to sound contradictory, but hear me out. He's not my favorite director of the 1970s, but I'd argue he's the greatest. I mean, let's start with the fact that the 1970s is my favorite decade of filmmaking, and in American movies, in my opinion, not one of Francis Ford Coppola's peers managed to match his accomplishments. And I'm talking about legends like Martin Scorsese, Brian De Palma, George Lucas, Robert Altman, William Friedkin, Peter Bogdanovich, Steven Spielberg, Terrence Malick, John Milius. I mean, the list of great new filmmakers from that period, it just goes on. And there are still some old leathery veterans like John Huston or Sam Peckinpah or Stanley Kubrick doing really, really good movies, some of the best movies of their career. And I've barely scratched the surface in all the amazing historic figures from this decade. It was a true golden age. But if you measure success by a combination of box office success, Academy Awards, festival prestige, and most important of all, the longevity of the movies, the enduring popularity of the movies, Coppola was the godfather of the 1970s. And if you want to know what does it take to be an artist in an industry like Hollywood, just check out his commentary track to The Godfather. I've been walking around New York the last couple of days listening to that commentary track, and it's just so nice having Francis Ford Coppola in your head. He does brilliant commentary tracks. He's really good at it. And he has an incredibly inviting way of speaking where you can understand why he was able to persuade so many people to kind of get on board with all of his various schemes and all of his mad ambitions, because he's incredibly persuasive. But throughout the course of his commentary track on The Godfather, he talks about all the problems that he faced in terms of constantly being threatened with being fired, or constantly meeting resistance on his casting choices, or being met with resistance on his editing choices. I mean, it was a fight every single step of the way. But we have the commentary track where he just walks us through everything from his perspective, and it's just absolutely fascinating. And when you look back at Coppola's career overall, you can see movies that are commercial entertainment, you can see movies that are intensely personal, and then sometimes you'll see movies that fall into both categories where he's working alongside his closest friends and family members, and he's just dropping in little seeds or little kernels or little details from his own life or from his family, which make even a blockbuster piece of entertainment like The Godfather feel like a really personal film. And the extended family of Coppola's, it's a true dynasty in filmmaking, and obviously it includes Carmine Coppola. Carmine Coppola, his father's contributed so much music to so many of his movies. Then, of course, you've got Sofia Coppola, who first appeared in The Godfather during the baptism scene, but then obviously went on to become a director in her own right. We got Roman Coppola, Nicolas Cage, Talia Shire, or as Coppola pronounces it, Talia Shire. I feel horrible saying Talia Shire, but Coppola has a New York accent. That's the way he says it. I call her Talia. And then, of course, we got Jason Schwartzman, and easily one of my favorite pictures in all of film history is seeing Francis Ford Coppola on the set of The Godfather Part II with little Sofia Coppola, who's just a toddler at the time, just hanging out. She's playing, and he's directing this, this masterwork. And I can't think of anything more satisfying in your life than being surrounded by your friends and your family members, even if you're experiencing the worst professional stress or financial stress or emotional stress imaginable making these giant movies. But if you're making movies that people love and you're surrounded by friends and family every step of the way, like that is kind of my idea of heaven. And as Coppola said himself, The Godfather is a movie about a family, made by a family, and I feel like that's the perfect way to describe his career. Now, if you're a giant film freak or a film buff or a film enthusiast, however you choose to describe yourself, you have your filmmakers that you've watched your entire life, and then you have the filmmakers that you've discovered once you take a specific interest in film history. And Coppola is one of those directors where I was watching his movies on repeat long before I ever knew him by name. And thanks to HBO, I got my start with Peggy Sue Got Married and Tucker the Man in His Dream and The Outsiders. The only way I can describe The Outsiders in the 1980s is it cast this really long shadow where just by having seen The Outsiders, it gave you instant cool status with certain kids, because all the stars in that movie went on to basically dominate the 1980s. But in that movie, they're the bad boys. And when you're a kid, a young kid, you look up to the bad boys. Oh my God, they're so cool. They're so confident. They're kind of dangerous. I want to be like them when I grow up. So, and I can even remember being at camp, summer 1986, when they were announcing to the different categories in the camp by age, which movie they were going to see on movie night. For us, we got to see Rocky III. But for the older group, they got to watch The Outsiders. And I remember when they made the announcement, the entire camp just went, wah! They all went crazy. So I was already very impressed by Coppola in the 1980s, even though I had no idea who he was. But my first Coppola movie that I saw in the theater was Bram Stoker's Dracula. I still did not know who Coppola was, but it felt very cool driving me and my sister to see that movie. And then in high school, an English teacher was teaching us the novel Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and he showed us Apocalypse Now. He must have mentioned Coppola by name, but I was just young and stupid and just totally ignored him. But then in 1995, I won the lottery when it came to the friends that I made in college, and one of our kind of regular traditions or rituals was to sit around drinking natural light, and on the crummiest little TV imaginable, on pan and scan VHS cassettes, we would watch the Godfather trilogy. So thank you, Nick Berry, for being the one to introduce me to the Godfather and explaining who the hell Francis Ford Coppola was. And I don't know how many times we repeated that ritual, but my lifelong admiration for Coppola was born then and there. And then we happened to study the conversation in my freshman year movie class. So all the stars were aligned. All the trajectory lines were moving in a direction of gaining an admiration for and respect for Francis Ford Coppola. And so from that point onward, I just regarded Francis Ford Coppola as an absolute god. And he's got at least 10 movies that I really like and a handful of movies that I regard as some of the best movies ever made. But before I get to my official list and my official ranking, I got a few more things that I want to say about the early days of his career. But if you want to skip ahead to the rankings, I'll include time codes below, and you can skip this lengthy preamble. But I do want to start with a little ancient history, because I feel like most discussions about Coppola begin with the horror film Dementia 13, which Francis Ford Coppola directed in 1963 for Roger Corman. And Coppola, he was barely in his mid-20s at that time. It's incredible just how ambitious and just how hardworking and just how driven he was at a very early age. But this opportunity, it didn't come out of the blue. And long before he was a working director and very long before he was a prestigious director, Coppola was grinding away looking for work wherever he could find it. Like after studying theater at Hofstra College in the 50s, he enrolled at UCLA Film School. And while he was still a student, he just jumped both feet first right into his filmmaking career while still taking classes. And while he didn't always work under his real name, he initially found work in the world of nudie cuties. And if you don't know what a nudie cutie is, they are so heartbreakingly innocent when you look back at them now. But basically, usually you have like a peeping Tom, like looking into a room where like 6 girls are like doing their hair and putting on their makeup, and they'll be topless, but you'll be like seeing them from behind. So it's implied that they're nude, but you don't really see anything. Like I said, they are very, very innocent. But Coppola got a start with a little short nudie cutie called The Peeper, and he got paid $3,000 for it. And then later he'd be paid additional money, or he was hired to re-edit an erotic western called Wide Open Spaces into a film called Tonight for Sure, where they incorporated the footage from The Peeper into Tonight for Sure. And this basically opened the door to a bunch of gigs where he would take existing movies and then shoot additional scenes and essentially Americanize them or repackage them for American audiences. Like a little-known movie called The Bellboy and the Playgirls, where he is credited by name, but I think the movie is borderline unwatchable. But they basically took a German nudie cutie or something resembling a nudie cutie, shot additional footage, and turned it into this really strange hybrid. But the reason I bring all this crap up is that it brought him to the attention of Roger Corman, whose greatest contribution to film history is not necessarily his work as a director, but instead giving opportunities to and discovering young filmmakers who would go on to define the periods in which they were basically legends in their own time. And alongside Coppola, Roger Corman discovered people like Peter Bogdanovich, Martin Scorsese, Joe Dante, James Cameron, Ron Howard, Penelope Spheris, Jonathan Demme, Jack Hill, Monty Hellman, Jack Nicholson, and many, many more. And oftentimes when you look at the credits for some of those Roger Corman movies, you'll see all of them basically getting like weird little roles and weird little jobs on the movies. Like you weren't allowed just to be a director or an auteur. It's like, no, you got to learn how to do sound, and you got to learn how to be a location scout. You got to learn how to do everything. In any case, while working for Corman, Coppola worked under a different name to Americanize a 1959 Russian science fiction film into what came to be known as Battle Beyond the Sun, released in 1962. And I've seen it, and it's in no danger of rearranging anybody's top 10 favorite Coppola movies. And then the following year, Coppola got a job working on Roger Corman's film, The Terror. And while it's credited to Roger Corman as the director, everybody got a turn in the director's chair. Apparently, Jack Hill, Monty Hellman, and Jack Nicholson, they all got a chance to direct, but I think Coppola directed for the longest. I think he got to direct for like 3 or 4 days. Don't quote me on the number of days he got to work, because who the hell absolutely knows. But after that gig on The Terror, he finally got his opportunity to fly solo as a director with the film Dementia 13, which I'll be getting to shortly. But my point in all of this is that Coppola didn't spring forth from nothing, a fully formed director ready to create masterpieces. He did his time in the trenches, he found work where he could, and he got practice. And I think that's something that sometimes filmmakers overlook is the value of practice. Write 100 scripts, shoot 50 commercials, do still photography, do paintings, like do whatever you got to do to kind of refine your palette and like basically become a more sophisticated storyteller, more sophisticated artist, because eventually an opportunity will come along where you get to show your stuff. But if you haven't done your time in the trenches, getting the practice that you need, well, then you'll blow those opportunities. And coincidentally, these little side gigs of his later on would save his bacon. Right when Paramount was considering firing him from The Godfather, in the middle of the shoot, I think like 2 weeks into the shoot, suddenly Coppola won an Oscar for working on the screenplay to Patton. And so you never know what side gigs or what other opportunities might help you on your main focus or your main opportunities. But while we're on the subject of Coppola and his time with Roger Corman and all of Roger Corman's discoveries, let's talk about some of Coppola's frequent collaborators and some of his discoveries, because his early kind of militia, or it was almost like the round table like in Camelot, but like in addition to his family members, he had some key friends, some key collaborators early on that he would work with for decades. And I'm talking about legends like Walter Murch. Like the films of the 1970s would be greatly diminished if they did not have the superb sound of Walter Murch, who basically completely revolutionized his entire industry. Or filmmakers like George Lucas. I mean, George Lucas got to start making movies that Coppola was producing. I mean, American Graffiti is one of the biggest hits of the 1970s, one of the most profitable films ever made, and Coppola produced it. Or guys like John Milius. I mean, John Milius' screenplay for Apocalypse Now was originally supposed to be directed by George Lucas in black and white in the late 60s, and obviously that all got rearranged. But when you listen to Coppola's commentaries and you hear all the contributions being made by his friends and collaborators, like here's a perfect example. On The Godfather, we all love those scenes where Vito Corleone's in the hospital, he's been shot, and basically Michael is there by himself trying to prevent his father from being killed. But you need a sense of suspense and dread when he first hears the footsteps coming into the hospital. But there was such a rush to shoot the film, he didn't have the time to just do like static shots of hallways going on and on and on so that you could hear the footsteps. But George Lucas stepped in during the editing and said, look, you've got like a half second of footage here after the camera stopped rolling and everybody stepped out of the frame. Just take that and just like multiply it over and over and over again until you have like a long enough shot where you can add the sound of footsteps. So it just shows how George Lucas was a key part of Coppola's empire early on before obviously he went off and formed an empire of his own. When it comes to the look of Coppola's movies, I mean, he's had the privilege of working with guys like Gordon Willis on multiple occasions, Vittorio Storaro on multiple occasions. These are some of the greatest directors of photography who have ever practiced their craft. But I haven't even mentioned basically the stock company of actors that Coppola worked with again and again and again, and some worked with him 1 or 2 times, some worked 3. Tom Waits appeared in no less than 6 of his movies. Robert Duvall, living legend, one of the greatest to ever do it, he appeared in 5. And then, of course, we got Lawrence Fishburne and James Caan and Diane Lane and Frederick Forrest. They all appeared in 4. And if you get into the actors who have worked with him 3 times, then you start opening the door to legends like John Cazale or Cazale, depending upon how New Yorker you want to be in your pronunciation of his name. But John Cazale, he worked on 5 movies in the 1970s before dying of cancer, but all of them were masterpieces. Godfather I, Conversation, Godfather Part II, and then with Sidney Lumet, he did Dog Day Afternoon, and then with Michael Cimino, did The Deer Hunter. But John Cazale, I feel like he brought so much to Coppola's movies. He was one of the all-time greats. And of course, you've got Al Pacino. Yeah, has anybody heard of Al Pacino? Yeah, he worked with Coppola a few times, or Nicolas Cage, or Terry Garb, and it's just incredible how many extraordinary actors he got to work with again and again and again. And it just seems like the lines between friends and collaborators and technicians and family, it all got very blurry, but that's what makes Coppola's whole filmography feel so intensely personal. So I got a few more things I want to get to before the official list. Once again, if you're tired of all this BS, just skip to the list. But one thing I find interesting about Coppola is how whenever he's doing an adaptation, and he does strict adaptations and he does less strict adaptations. Like if you look at the novel The Godfather compared to the movie, there's a lot of that novel that is missing from the movie. Like this entire giant subplot of this doctor helping Sonny Corleone's mistress getting like a vaginal reduction surgery. I mean, it's like incredible how many pages are devoted to that, and so much so that Coppola didn't even want to adapt it. But then when he started seeing the story of the family and the story of Vito and the story of Michael and passing on his empire, that's where he started to take an interest. So, but it's incredible just how unfaithful an adaptation that first movie is, and then obviously all the stuff from Vito as a young man got saved and then used in the second movie. But it's like if you're one of those people that's handing out speeding tickets to directors for not doing strict adaptations of books, well, Coppola would be guilty of that. But what he does do, which I find fascinating, he likes to include the author's name above the movies. Not Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather or The Godfather Part II. It's Mario Puzo's The Godfather or The Godfather Part II. And I find that to be, I guess, showing a certain amount of reverence for these authors. Or S.E. Hinton, who wrote The Outsiders as well as Rumblefish, or Bram Stoker's Dracula. I just think it's a really cool tradition. Like in an industry that's known for spitting on and shitting on and destroying great works of literature or even trashy bestsellers, at least Coppola's trying to tip his hat and show that the hard work was done initially by these authors. And while it's easy to focus on all the great movies that he personally directed, he also did a lot of incredible work as a producer. And I think one of the coolest things he ever did in his career was when he teamed up with George Lucas in the late 70s to basically help Akira Kurosawa kind of get his career going again. Akira Kurosawa, I don't want to turn this into a Kurosawa video, but he was suffering from a variety of professional and personal difficulties in the 1970s, but he really wanted to get his film Kagemusha off the ground. But first George Lucas got on board, and then Francis Ford Coppola as a co-producer. They helped Kagemusha get some vital financing from 20th Century Fox, which leads to one of Kurosawa's most famous movies, Ran, which is his adaptation of King Lear. But if not for Coppola and Lucas stepping in and helping with Kagemusha getting off the ground, who knows if Kurosawa would have enjoyed that great final chapter to his career. And while this video is primarily focused on Coppola's feature films, there are some weird curiosities and shorts and kind of side productions that he did that are worth mentioning. Like, I had never seen it prior to getting prepared for this video, but Captain EO from 1986, which Coppola technically did direct, but it's like a 3D theme park attraction featuring Michael Jackson in a sci-fi kids movie where basically at the end of the movie he solves everybody's problems by doing a big dance. But the movie's terrible. It's unwatchable. But if you are an MJ fanatic, I was for a brief shining moment when Thriller came out, but by the time Captain EO came around, I'd already lost interest. But definitely hunt that down.
We're going in.
But I guess a great way to kind of wrap up this opening preamble is just describing how Coppola is one of the most nimble, improvisational, adaptable directors that I've ever heard of, where, because he's a screenwriter, anytime he has a problem, where he can write himself out of a tight spot or write himself out of a corner, because anytime you're making a movie, whether it's a short film just on the streets of New York or a giant $200 million production, you are going to encounter problems. Like on The Godfather Part II, the actor who played Clemenza, he would only agree to be in the movie if he could bring his own screenwriter to write his own dialogue. And Coppola's like, well, I can't put my faith in another writer just to write your dialogue, which might not have any bearing on what's come before or after. And so instead, Coppola just wrote himself out of a corner, having characters wearing the armband referring to Clemenza's recent death. I would have loved to have seen Clemenza in The Godfather Part II, but that's a situation where Coppola was forced to adapt. And he's one of those directors where if you suddenly have a torrential downpour or a blizzard or whatever the case might be, he just regards that as free special effects. So he will write it into the movie. And sometimes that can backfire. I mean, famously, he was told that when he was going to be shooting Apocalypse Now, he would be there in the Philippines during the rainy season, not really realizing that that meant monsoons. He said, oh, well, it'll be a rainy movie. And then, of course, his sets got destroyed and the film got delayed. So that, I guess, that open-minded attitude, it doesn't always lead to success, but I do think it's a key part of his process, where it's not like he has a perfect idea of what the movie is in advance. The movie is an experience that he's about to endure, and he's kind of improvise along the way. And some of those improvisations with his actors lead to some of the best scenes in his movies, like the little thing in Godfather when Marlon Brando puts the orange peels into his mouth. The scene wasn't working, and it was a scene that Paramount didn't even want him to shoot. They kept trying to cancel the scene. So everybody's trying to get it off the schedule. And then on the day of, the kid wasn't really cooperating. So Brando had the idea of the orange peels, and the kid's like, eh. And anyway, it makes the scene. And in a lot of ways, that scene makes the movie. So once again, it just shows how Coppola can pull poetic beauty out of his ass thanks to his ability and his willingness to be nimble and to be dexterous and to be improvisational when required to. So I think I've gotten most of my intro out of my system. Let's start talking about some of these movies. And with a lot of these movies, there are multiple versions out there. And the reasons why there's so many multiple cuts are different from movie to movie, but I'll try to call attention to which versions that I have seen the most versus which versions that I like the most versus which versions I've recently seen for the first time that I'm still processing. Like when you watch a new cut of a movie that you're very familiar with, and forgive me for being a little vulgar for a second, but when you watch a movie that you're very familiar with, where it's suddenly different, where the music cues are different, or there's new scenes, it's a little bit like hooking up with an old girlfriend where you're kind of craving the experience and the memories that you had, a long time ago, but suddenly everything's different. You're like, wait a second, like, who taught you how to do that? Like, which guy were you hooking up with, blah, blah, blah. And obviously, maybe that implies that I have too intimate a relationship with the movies that I like. But if you've seen a movie many, many times and you're expecting it to give you those rhythms, it can be very jarring when you hear a different music cue. Like with The Outsiders, you recently had a cut where a lot of the music that was kind of an homage to Gone with the Wind has been replaced with music that's more kind of like, rock and roll music and that sort of thing.
Pony boy, I wasn't trying to give you charity.
And it can be very distracting if you're expecting The Outsiders just to give you the experience that you had decades ago. But anyway, I'll do my best to call attention to all the different cuts, what I would recommend for the first viewing versus what you might want to watch after you've become very familiar with the movie. But let's dive right in with my number 23. And I put up a poll on my YouTube channel as well as on Twitter to see like what are the most kind of ignored or unloved or movies by Coppola that deserve more recognition. And I got a lot of interesting answers. Rumblefish came up more than any other, by far, by a healthy margin. But every once in a while, someone would say, oh, well, I really love Jack, or I really love Finian's Rainbow, I really love Youth Without Youth. So every single movie, even if I regard it as one of Coppola's worst, is going to end up being a movie that a lot of people regard as like an unloved classic by Coppola. So I apologize in advance for, talking some trash about anybody's favorite Coppola movies or, kind of dark horse candidates for his most obscure, unloved movies, blah, blah, blah. But for me, number 23 is Jack from 1996. And I was 20 years old when this movie came out. I just fallen in love with Coppola's films from the 70s. So to have this movie come out, which for me kind of represented the apotheosis or the peak of the late 90s trend of these kind of nauseating feel-good dramedies. And there were a lot of them that came out at this time. Like, what prevents me from being nostalgic about this period is all these horrendous kind of feel-good, kind of sad and weepy semi-comedy movies that came out. Movies like Pay It Forward and crap like that. And Robin Williams, while he was one of the all-time greats, he did appear in a lot of these shitty, sad and weepy kind of semi-dramedies in the late 90s. And so I skipped Jack when it came out. I just saw it for the first time after, 27 years of avoiding it. And I almost didn't get through it. I basically said, like, life's too short. I'm going to bail on this. But then Jennifer Lopez showed up, and obviously Diane Lane showed up. I was like, all right, maybe I can stick with this. But just to keep things relatively positive, if you are a Robin Williams completionist or Francis Ford Coppola completionist, definitely hunt it down. And there are some personal ingredients that are kind of tucked away inside this, where you've got a Coppola dealing with the grief of the death of a child, but I think this movie is the worst movie that he ever made. But if you're worried that this portion of the video is just going to be me using his late period films as a punching bag, not to worry. I have some disdain for some of his earlier movies as well, which leads me to my number 22, Finian's Rainbow from 1968. It is absolutely stunningly photographed, and during the opening credits, I was like, whoa, is this going to be a Coppola classic that I've been ignoring all this time? But then the character started singing, and I was like, oh my God, like, I wanted to rip my ears off and throw them in the trash and, like, set my head on fire. There are certain musicals where, every note that is performed by every single, singer or dancer in the movie, where it makes you just want to, recoil in horror. And Finian's Rainbow is one of those movies. The moment the fucking leprechaun showed up and started singing and dancing, I was like, what are we doing? Like, do I want to stop watching movies for good entirely? But Fred Astaire, who is obviously one of the greats. I like his movies from the 30s, 40s, and early 50s. Like, if you look at the period from, like, Swing Time through Bandwagon, there are a lot of good musicals. And I don't even really like musicals, but the dude, he knew how to do some tap dancing, and the movie briefly comes to life when he does some tap dancing here. But this movie is absolutely endless, and I think unless you are just obsessed with Fred Astaire, avoid Finian's Rainbow like the plague, or unless you just really love musicals from any era. But I think if you want to point to a period where musicals were at their absolute rock bottom, it would be the late 1960s. But let's push on to my number 21, a movie which I just saw for the first time, Youth Without Youth from 2007, which was Coppola's big comeback film after a 10-year hiatus. And it's a little misleading to say that he was on a hiatus because he was doing things like recutting Apocalypse Now for Apocalypse Now Redux, or he was doing things like producing The Virgin Suicides with his daughter Sofia Coppola. I mean, he was active, but he wasn't in the director's chair, which is how most people kind of wrestle with his career. I feel like whatever youth you might still possess in your system, whatever age you might be, it will be extinguished and destroyed by watching Youth Without Youth, because it's just a slow, tedious, ponderous movie, which does have its fans and admirers. When I put up my polls in what is a movie by Coppola that deserves more love and affection, some people did respond, Youth Without Youth. So if you love Tim Roth, I think it's worth seeing. And it's interesting seeing, it's basically almost like a test drive, or so basically like a first pass of what would later become The Curious Case of Benjamin Button by David Fincher. But you have a situation where a very, very old man back in the 1930s, I think in Budapest, gets a second lease on life and gets a chance to kind of complete his life work. And I guess the most interesting part was just seeing Tim Roth kind of taking all of his bits and pieces for a test drive after regaining some youth and vitality. But yeah, I thought this movie was pretty brutal and pretty insufferable. But if you love it, more power to you. I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong, because, to each their own. But another late period movie, which I really did not enjoy, which is going to be my number 20, is Twixt from 2011, which up until recently was his most recent movie. And in 2022, he re-edited a director's cut called Betwixt Now and Sunrise. The only version of Twixt that I've seen is Betwixt Now and Sunrise. I don't know if I made the right choice or the wrong choice, but as I was getting prepared for this video, I was like, I need to see all the movies by him that I haven't seen. And Twixt was one of those movies, so I've only seen his reimagining of it, which came out 2 years ago. But as much as I might love Val Kilmer, I kind of hated Twixt or Betwixt Now and Sunrise. It's so self-consciously arty and so self-consciously, like, deliberately weird. It feels a little bit like an aging filmmaker trying to recapture the spontaneity and the energy of his youth, and that just makes it feel pretentious. I feel like this movie, it wouldn't have hurt it to be a little trashier and a little more kind of genre-focused. But, at this point in his life, Coppola's allowed to make whatever the hell movie that he wants. If that's the story he wanted to tell, more power to him. But I feel like Twixt, it had some potential, but I think it's a very tedious, very tiresome, very boring piece of film to watch. And maybe one day I'll go back and revisit it and reassess it. But as I was ripping through all of Coppola's filmography, I just felt like Twixt, it didn't compare very favorably to the rest of his filmography. Now I'm going to kind of break the rules that I created for this video, because I wanted to rank all of his feature films. But I'm going to include one short, only because that short is part of a larger feature film, and I'm talking about New York Stories from 1989. So that's my number 19. But New York Stories was an opportunity for Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and Woody Allen, three quintessential New York directors, to get together and all make a little vignette for an overall anthology. And with Coppola, he wrote his short alongside Sofia Coppola. Sofia Coppola, while she was still, kind of figuring out, do I want to be an actress? Do I want to be a filmmaker? And obviously by the late 90s and early 2000s, she was like, yeah, I'm going to be a director. But at this point, she was still trying to figure out what path she wanted to take before starring in The Godfather III the following year. But I think Coppola's segment in here is the weakest of the three. I don't even really like Woody Allen's segment. The only reason to watch New York Stories is to see the Scorsese section, which is so good, it'll make your head spin. I think it's one of the best short films that I've ever seen. So watch New York Stories, watch the opening part with Nick Nolte and Rosanna Arquette, and you'll be absolutely blown away. And then you'll be really frustrated and disappointed when you get to the Coppola and Woody Allen sections. But I just love the fact that three of the quintessential New York directors of the time. And as somebody who has basically moved to New York, because I'm obsessed with the movies that were shot here and took place here, the only thing that could have made it possibly more interesting is if they'd invited Brian De Palma to be a part of it, or if they'd invited Spike Lee to be a part of it. Like, there's certain directors that are from this area or have kind of made New York their home that have defined the city. But New York Stories, an interesting curiosity, but not one of Coppola's best efforts as a director. But from a number 18, we can finally start talking about some of Coppola's movies that are kind of sort of good or kind of sort of interesting, and then we're going to get into the ones that are really good. But for my number 18, I'm going with You're a Big Boy Now from 1966, which I just saw for the first time. Actually, I'll be right back. I just bought the DVD. So this bad boy is kind of hard to find. It's an obscure film. He made it right before Finian's Rainbow. This was after his Roger Corman period. And I think if he had been able to find someone like Richard Dreyfuss to be the lead, it might be a very different movie. But I find the lead actor, who I'm not even going to mention by name, he's so boring and so strange and just so off-putting. And some people might watch him like, oh, this is like, almost like a precursor to a movie like The Graduate. Like, I find him fascinating. If you don't like the central character of a movie, it's very hard to get invested. But I did like the fact that people like Rip Torn show up in it. But this movie is such a strange late 60s or mid-60s time capsule where the humor doesn't work for me at all. The music choices don't work for me at all. Like I kind of felt like I was going insane while watching it. I was like, it's one of those weird tweeners where it's a 60s movie where the 70s are about to arrive. Every child before they become an adult have like their awkward phase where like they've grown too quickly and they're kind of gangly and they're kind of bad posture. Like this is Coppola in his awkward phase. And there are a few little interesting details, like when a character walks through a club and Dementia 13's playing on the wall, or we get a little a glimpse into peep show culture with some black and white pornography where the main character gets his tie caught in the projector. So there's some funny bits in there, but yeah, I found this movie to be a little deranged. But there are people out there who will defend it tooth and nail as one of Coppola's, obscure classics that needs to be rediscovered and reassessed. So if you're one of those people, make the case. But I will not do that heavy lifting. But from a number 17, we're going to get into the first Coppola movie that I kind of like, Dementia 13, which is, for me, his true directorial debut. It's his first feature film for real with his name, even though he had been credited as the director in full on The Bellboy and the Playgirls.
You will be given a test prepared by Dr. Bryant to determine your ability to withstand shock. Those unable to pass this test will not be admitted to the theater.
Now, this would mark the end of Coppola's affiliation with Roger Corman, although Corman would continue to show up in some of Coppola's movies later on. Roger Corman's always making cameos in the movies of the directors that he kind of helped bring along. And so if you're watching The Godfather Part II, when you're seeing that trial, that Senate committee hearing, Roger Corman is in the mix. But Dementia 13 is kind of a proto-slasher movie. Like, depending on who you ask, how much of a horror junkie they are, everybody's got a different answer for when the slasher genre really got up and running. And some will go as far back as Psycho. I don't really regard Psycho as a slasher movie. Some will say Black Christmas in the early 70s, or some will say something like Bay of Blood by Mario Bava. But I think Dementia 13 deserves to be mentioned in that conversation. Even if it's not a slasher movie, it has one scene by a lake where you're like, whoa. Like you're seeing the future of Friday the 13th, right there in that scene where you've got a lake, pretty girl, and a killer with an axe, and that's kind of all the ingredients you need for a slasher movie. So I think this movie is pretty inert, and it's pretty trashy and pretty dull, but it does have its moments where suddenly it comes to life. You're like, all right, Coppola, he's got some chops, he's got some skill, he's got some talent, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if someone like George Romero was watching this movie and starting to get the idea for movies like Night of the Living Dead. There's a scene where a dead woman's hanging from a hook, which is really hardcore for 1963. And when you see it, you're like, ooh, this could almost be like an outtake. Night of the Living Dead, which came out 5 years later. So Dementia 13, if you're a horror fan, definitely hunt it down. And for me, it represents the true first chapter in Francis Ford Coppola's career as a director. But for my next movie, number 16, we're going to go with a 2009 movie, Tetro. And while a lot of people justifiably talk a little trash about Coppola's later work, Tetro was a very happy surprise as I was getting prepared for this video. You got some really good performances in here by Vincent Gallo. It's got Alden Ehrenreich, who's kind of just getting started with his career. We've got Maribel Verdú, who is just absolutely stunning in this. And the movie's shot in glorious black and white, and if you are a black and white enthusiast, there are some nude scenes and some erotic scenes in Tetro. And there's something about an erotic scene shot in black and white where it just comes to life. But basically at one point, these girls decide that Alden Ehrenreich's character is a little bit too innocent for their taste, and they're going to deflower him and give him, the best night of his life. And you're like, all right, Coppola, you've got my full unbridled attention. But what makes Tetro so special is all the autobiographical ingredients that are included in here about these two brothers and their relationship with their father. And I don't want to get sidetracked with all of Coppola's personal biography, but if you just read The Path to Paradise, when you see just all the conflicted relationships between his father and his father's brother and Coppola and his own siblings and his children, it's a tough burden to be a creative person in a family where some people are already established and creative or regarded as a genius. And I think if you want to examine Coppola's kind of unresolved feelings on that front, or to see how he wrestles with all those feelings, Tetro is the movie to see. So I think Tetro is probably the best reason to still be excited about what Coppola can do. And in a lot of ways, it's like a spiritual sequel to Rumblefish. I feel like Rumblefish and Tetro would make a great double feature where they're both kind of self-consciously arty and that sort of thing. They're both in black and white. They're both movies about brothers. So yeah, Rumblefish and Tetro, they have a lot in common. I just think Rumblefish is the better movie. But let's move into my number 15, The Rainmaker. And in the 1990s, I think there were 7 John Grisham movies, John Grisham novels that got adapted into movies. Suddenly, I think it was after The Firm did really well. Everybody's like, all right, well, what else have you got? But I think The Firm by Sidney Pollack is probably the best John Grisham adaptation, but The Rainmaker is a strong contender for the second best John Grisham adaptation. And I never read any of John Grisham's books. I don't know how faithful it might be. But if you like legal dramas, Jesus Christ, read John Grisham's books and then see all the movies that were made from his books in the 1990s. But The Rainmaker, Danny DeVito's incredible in this. Danny Glover's incredible in this. Matt Damon, I know people love to make fun of him for a variety of reasons, but he's pretty goddamn good in this. Even Mickey Rourke is pretty good in this. So I won't say that I'm some sort of aficionado for legal dramas, but if you are going to watch one, you could do worse than The Rainmaker. But number 14, Gardens of Stone from 1987. And this is one of those movies where I feel like even a weaker Francis Ford Coppola movie in the 1980s was still a pretty goddamn good movie because, first and foremost, you have the most unreal cast that you could possibly get your hands on. Like, there are scenes where it's just actors sitting around a table flirting and having dinner and having drinks where it's like, oh my God, like the art form of cinema has so completely deteriorated since this time where like you don't even have like the technicians or the craftspeople or the performers who know how to create a scene that's this authentic anymore. But watching James Earl Jones and James Caan and Angelica Houston and all these actors, it's just a very intense reminder that of all the directors who have ever lived or have ever come out of the American filmmaking scene, very few directors can compete with Coppola when it comes to his work with actors. He's got a true gift for working with actors. I think to work with actors, you have to love actors. You have to love all their complexities and all their imperfections and all their insecurities and that sort of thing. You have to be a lion tamer, but you have to figure out, how do I get the best out of these strange individuals? Like anybody who can work with Marlon Brando in Apocalypse Now and all the ways that he was basically trying to destroy that movie, and you can still try to get a good performance out of him, you have to have a lot of patience. And I think Gardens of Stone is worth watching just as a showcase for all these actors, actors like Lawrence Fishburne and Dean Stockwell and more. It's just astonishing. But I think the big flaw of Gardens of Stone is that no filmmaker should revisit the same topic twice inside the same 10-year period. And Gardens of Stone is about the Vietnam War. You're seeing it from the perspective at home of soldiers who are trying to get into the war or avoid the war, depending upon their point of view. But he had just made Apocalypse Now, 8 years prior. I'm sorry, even if you're Francis Ford Coppola, once you make Apocalypse Now, stay away from the Vietnam War forever and just let that be your Vietnam film. But Gardens of Stone, it wasn't a retread in any way, shape, or form because it's dealing with so many different concerns. And obviously, there are plenty of filmmakers out there who are happy to cover the same ground twice. Like Oliver Stone, I don't know how many times Vietnam has come up in his movies, but Oliver Stone was not afraid to tackle the same period twice or 3 times or 4 times. But I just feel like Gardens of Stone will always be unfavorably compared to Apocalypse Now. But if you love the actors and you wanted to see like just how deftly Coppola could handle a really cool cast, I think Gardens of Stone is still worth hunting down. But number 13, let's start with the first Francis Ford Coppola movie that I ever saw. Peggy Sue Got Married from 1986. And also, coincidentally, it was the first time that I saw Nicolas Cage in action. And it might have been the first time I saw Jim Carrey in action. But Once Bitten came out in the same year. So it was either Once Bitten or Peggy Sue Got Married when I got introduced to Jim Carrey. But thanks to Romancing the Stone, I already had what I would describe as a bit of like a mommy fetish for Kathleen Turner. I mean, you have to remember, I was 10 when Peggy Sue got married, and I was just getting interested in girls. Romancing the Stone. I mean, if you've seen that, or if you've seen Crimes of Passion, or if you've seen Body Heat, like you'll be obsessed with Kathleen Turner for the rest of your life. But my crush on her was alive and well when this movie came out. So I must have watched it 50 times on HBO. And this is basically the character-driven drama version of Back to the Future, where instead of using science fiction to have somebody travel through time, somebody just faints at their 25th high school reunion, and they get to go back and live a few days in 1960 and do all the things that they regret that they did not do, like whether that's sleeping with the interesting dynamic poet or helping inspire a nerdy science geek into achieving his greatest heights in his career later on in life, or wrestling with her unresolved feelings towards Nicolas Cage, who was her big, high school boyfriend who she married way too young, and they ultimately got divorced. But this was also my first exposure to doo-wop, and I think that scene, it really plays. I think the whole movie is worth watching just to see Jim Carrey and Nicolas Cage standing up there and performing. I Wonder Why. I mean, I just revisited the film a couple of days ago, and that scene gave me chills all over again. I wonder why I love you like I do. And it just shows how you don't necessarily have to start with The Godfather to have an appreciation for Francis Ford Coppola. You can kind of start anywhere, but Peggy Sue Got Married is where I got started, and so it'll always occupy a special place in my heart. But for my number 12, we're going to get into The Rain People from 1969. And as I was watching it, I started getting prepared for this video weeks ago because I realized, oh shit, Megalopolis is coming. You need to get up to speed on Coppola. And I'd never seen The Rain People, but even though I didn't really like it at the time while I was watching it, a funny thing happened over the last couple of weeks. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. There's certain scenes where the acting is just so goddamn good and the emotions are so upsetting and so uncomfortable that you won't be able to shake it. It's not necessarily a pleasant experience, but if you want to see James Caan as a young man, aka he's nicknamed Killer in this, it's not his earliest stuff. I think the earliest James Caan stuff I've seen were his Howard Hawks movies like El Dorado and Redline 7000, but this is a young James Caan, and it's how obviously he got his job in The Godfather. But we've got Robert Duvall in here, and I think Robert Duvall, he totally steals the show. He's just so natural and so confident and so fantastic. And one of the funniest scenes I've ever seen in my life, he brings a woman back to his trailer trying to hook up.
Can I watch?
You little bitch, I'm gonna break your ass.
Who are you, Papa?
And he's tormented by this daughter who just absolutely will not listen to a single word he says. So he's trying desperately to do his thing, and he just keeps getting cock-blocked by his daughter. And it's just absolutely fucking hysterical. But if you don't like staginess, or I shouldn't say staginess because most of this movie is outdoors or on the open road, but if you don't like kind of experimental black box theater, you might struggle to get through this movie. But I think even if you hate improvisational sounding dialogue or movies with a really slow pace, I think when you watch it, like D.P. Wilmer Butler, or Vilmer Butler, not sure how he pronounces it, like it's got stunning photography, it's got brilliant acting. It just doesn't have much of like a story to get invested in. But what's amazing is how this would be the last movie he directed before he got his big break directing The Godfather shortly thereafter. But we need to make one last stop before we get to my top 10. And so for my number 11, I've got Tucker, the Man in His Dream from 1988, which I did see more times than I can count on HBO back in the day. And it's funny how, like, in spite of all my childhood affection for it, I don't really like it that much now. Like the screenplay feels so much like a formulaic biopic in a lot of ways. However, it was shot by Vittorio Storaro. It looks stunning. And the cast is totally invested. I mean, Jeff Bridges, he's all in. Christian Slater is all in. Joan Allen is incredible in this. Like, Joan Allen, she had already appeared in Peggy Sue Got Married, but she played kind of like the nerdy, awkward girl. Here, she's in her sexy phase. Like, there's this great bit where Jeff Bridges is driving up to his family with this tank that he developed for World War II that only got turned down because it was considered to be too fast. And she does this thing where she's hitchhiking, and she pulls up her dress to kind of reveal part of her leg. But anyway, it's just so natural, and it really just sets the tone that as husband and wife, like they still have the hots for each other. They're still very invested in each other. And yeah, this movie's cool, but I'm not much of a car buff. I think if you're a car buff and you're fascinated by these old rear engine cars that apparently had better traction when they were first introduced, but you're basically watching an idealist and an innovator going to war with all the big car manufacturers. And so it's a story where you can see kind of Tucker's career mirroring parts of Coppola's career, but also I believe Coppola's father was one of the investors in Tucker and the rear-engine car. But I'd have to reread that section from here to totally confirm that. But it was a dream project. It was a vanity project. It is interesting, and there are a lot of Coppola fans out there who hold it in very high regard. And for me, it's number 11, so I hold it. I guess I hold it high enough. But now let's stop bullshitting and fucking around, and let's get into the official top 10 Francis Ford Coppola movies. All right, so we're officially in the top 10. I think this is where some of my choices will start getting some real pushback from my fellow Francis Ford Coppola enthusiasts. But for my number 10, I'm going with The Godfather Part III from 1990. And I finally did see the Coda cut, or The Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone, which came out a couple years ago, but it's available on Paramount Plus. They've got Godfather Part 1 and 2, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, the Coda cut, it does a few minor changes where it takes a key scene that's 40 minutes in and moves it to the opening, so the plot gets started immediately as opposed to just having a lot of kind of character and flavor and that sort of thing. It just gets the story up and running, and I do think that change works. And there's some modifications to the very end in terms of the final shots that you see, because I think nobody has ever really liked the shots of Michael kind of going ugh, kind of collapsing in the chair. Or at least I never liked that shot. I always thought it was a little melodramatic. But I do think the Coda cut is an improvement over the original Godfather Part III. But all my major complaints about the Godfather Part III are still very much, at play. And I gave this movie 100 chances to win me over. But like I said, my friends and I in college, we'd chug a bunch of beer and we would just watch 1, 2, and 3. And sometimes we'd throw in Carlito's Way and Scarface just to get like the full Al Pacino experience. I mean, we just for days on end, we'd watch nothing but gangster movies. The stuff in this movie that works, I think Andy Garcia was solid gold casting as Vincent. And I think every scene in which he appears, he manages to make it interesting. And also Bridget Fonda's in here. She's just heart attack inducing. But I think Joe Mantegna was miscast. I don't buy a single scene in which he appears. I think Sofia Coppola was unfortunately miscast. No Robert Duvall in here really hurts, but also because all the characters were dying in parts 1 and 2, you have no James Caan, you've got no John Cazale, you've got no Marlon Brando. Like once you start losing Clemenza and Tessio and all these other characters, like at what point have you lost so many characters where it's no longer The Godfather? And I feel like The Godfather Part III is where it stops feeling like The Godfather, because also they keep trying to recreate the rhythms and the emotions of certain scenes or tropes that have been established in the first 2 movies, but they just feel like they're being not phoned in, but they just start to feel overly familiar. Like, I know this kind of setup and I know this kind of scene. I know what you're going for because you already did it in the previous 2 movies. But I think the reality is Coppola needed the money. And even though everybody likes to focus on his trials and tribulations making Apocalypse Now in the late 70s, it was One from the Heart that destroyed from his career, which we'll be getting to in a sec. But One from the Heart, soundstage-bound musical fantasy film or romantic comedy, not even romantic comedy, but just a movie about romance, but it just went so over budget and was so grand in its aspirations and ambitions, and then nobody showed up. And Coppola basically spent years in debt, and financially, Coppola wasn't ever really able to recover from making movies. He was able to recover from the wine biz, and it's due to selling off a huge chunk of his wine biz that he was able to make Megalopolis all these years later. So if you were just a businessman, he would just stayed in the wine biz and retired with hundreds of millions of dollars. And I just think it's hilarious how he had to go off and make his fortune in another industry in order to make his dream project, which he wrote in 1983. But getting back to The Godfather Part III, I think it was an obvious potential hit. Just make The Godfather Part III, charge a bunch of cash, pay off some of your debts, and so on and so forth. But I think ultimately my biggest complaint about The Godfather Part III, even though it does have good scenes that I like, when Andy Garcia kills Joe Mantegna, it's a cool scene. But there's not a single scene in the entire movie that can go toe-to-toe with or be mentioned in the same breath with the great scenes from the first 2 movies. Like, whatever your favorite scenes are from The Godfather and The Godfather Part II, those scenes are some of the most powerful scenes in the history of cinema. It's like, how do you compare The Godfather 3, anything in The Godfather 3, with the baptism scene from The Godfather? It's just, they're trying to recreate some of those emotions with the climax of the film. It is like, ugh, this just feels like the thrill is gone. And once the thrill is gone, it's hard to get back. So I still regard it in his top 10. Like I said, I've seen it many, many, many times, but let's just move on to my number 9, One from the Heart from 1981. which I just saw for the first time a couple weeks ago. So One from the Heart from 1981. What can we say about this? The reason I decided to finally see it is because of this book, because so much of this book is concerned with the destruction of American zoetrope while making it. I was like, God damn, like, even though I don't really like musicals, I guess I'm going to have to see One from the Heart. And shout out to filmmaker Bill Tech, who's always defended this movie, but this is the most recent addition to my top 10. I didn't think that after all these years of obsessing over Coppola, that any movie could come along and rearrange my top 10, but One from the Heart managed to do it. But basically Coppola went from the chaos of the jungle in the Philippines to the chaos of the soundstage. But there are some interesting ingredients in here, and there are also some ingredients that are so god-awful that it makes it kind of unwatchable at times. But what helps is that we have Vittorio Storaro, once again, back as the director of photography, who he could close his eyes and get hit in the head with a hammer and still compose and set up a beautiful shot with beautiful lighting. But the reason I kind of fell in love with this movie is due to my love and affection for Terry Garr. And one of the first movies I ever saw in the theater was Mr. Mom back in the day. And so I was like, she's kind of cool. And once again, talking about mommy fetishes with Kathleen Turner. I also had a mommy fetish with Terry Garr. So many mommy fetishes back in the 1980s when I was a kid. But, Young Frankenstein. I mean, Terry Garr, she was a knockout. She could do light comedy, and she could also do romance. And so seeing Terry Garr, this might be her finest performance, where she's so angelic and so sexy all at once, and just talking to her friend about how she's like, I want to meet men and I want erotic things to happen to me. I mean, I love all that stuff.
I want to live. This is what I want. I want to go out with a bunch of guys. I want erotic things to happen.
And luckily she eventually bumps into Raul Julia, and he is, he was a stud in any era, but Raul Julia was in like peak masculinity mode here. And one of the funniest things that I've ever seen in my life is watching him whip out a pair of nunchucks to try to scare off Frederick Forrest when Frederick Forrest is trying to interrupt the lovemaking toward the end of the movie. I mean, I was like, all right, only in 1981 would you get Raul Julia wielding nunchucks in his underwear trying to defend his lady love from being taken away from her. But it's just hilarious to me how many times Coppola would return to the musical in spite of getting so many mixed results. Like Finian's Rainbow, I do not like. One from the Heart was a commercial disaster of the most epic proportions imaginable. Or even The Cotton Club has some musical ingredients, quite a few musical ingredients. But no one thinks of, like, whenever people talk about Coppola, like, oh, he made The Apocalypse Now, he made, personal art films, and he made gangster films. But he made a lot of musicals. I think what prevents this movie from working is like, he's got the dream factory. He's got everything you could possibly need on a soundstage to tell this musical or to tell this love story. I think Frederick Forrest was incredibly miscast in this movie, as was to a degree Natasha Kinski. I mean, Natasha Kinski was very easy on the eyes in 1981, but the romance scenes between the two of them, they are limp, to put it mildly. And while Frederick Forrest might have been perfectly cast in Apocalypse Now, I think he is one of the great kind of Achilles heels to this movie. But he's one of Coppola's oldest collaborators. I mean, he was there in the friggin' conversation, so I understand why he got brought in. But I just feel like at this point, Frederick Forrest was just too old and too awkward and kind of too much of a goober to play a romantic leading man. But you got Harry Dean Stanton here, who's incredible. And there's songs that I like, however, with the overall soundtrack or the overall score, you got a lot of Tom Waits. And I feel like Tom Waits is a crooner with that scratchy voice. He's great when he's just doing his own thing. But when he's harmonizing with somebody who has a very clear voice that hits the exact precise middle of every note, well, then suddenly it makes Tom Waits seem like he's a little bit off pitch or out of key. Like Tom Waits, I feel like he's a great lounge lizard kind of guy, but if you're going to bring in like a beautiful melodious singer, they're going to make him look bad. So I feel like as an exercise in pure style, as an exercise in pure artifice, One from the Heart is fascinating to watch, but it is a deeply flawed movie that also happens to be deliriously entertaining at times. And I just think it's a miracle that this movie even exists. Like, it's as much a cautionary tale as Apocalypse Now, but with very different results. But I think it's right up there with Heaven's Gate or any other runaway production that you've ever heard of. So if you're interested in film history and runaway productions, One from the Heart absolutely deserves your full attention. But climbing the ranks to my number 8, The Cotton Club from 1984, and I finally saw the encore cut of The Cotton Club, which came out back in 2019, and that version runs for 139 minutes. It's got a few more musical numbers, which may or may not be a good thing, depending upon your feelings about the musical numbers in The Cotton Club, but You get a little more character development, and you get fewer scenes of some of the 1920s era celebrities. So basically, the pitch for the Cotton Club when it came out in the 80s was it's going to be The Godfather, but with music. And it's a Prohibition era gangster movie that takes place in New York, where it's the time of Duke Ellington, it's the time of big band music. It's a really cool period. I think a lot of this movie works great. But I think one of the big inherent flaws in it is that you've got two different central storylines that oftentimes are kind of going in very different directions, where it almost feels like it could be two different movies. Like, there's the story of Gregory Hines, which is fascinating in its own right. You got brilliant tap dancing and a wonderful story about the destruction of a relationship between two brothers and their ultimate reconciliation. And then you've got the story of the cornet player played by Richard Gere, who's in love with Diane Lane, who happens to be the object of a fixation or obsession of a gangster played by James Remar. And I feel like both of those movies could have been really cool, tight, economical feature films in their own right. And also we get Bob Hoskins in gangster mode as well. Bob Hoskins had just done the Long Good Friday recently, and so he was in full-blown kick-ass gangster mode, and he's incredible in this. And Richard Gere is in his absolute cocky prime. Diane Lane is in absolute goddess mode. You got Nick Cage in here. You got so many good ingredients, but like I said, I just think there are a lot of problems. I think oftentimes they overdo it with the music, where you're watching the movie, get a great musical sequence, and it's just incredible. The best tap dancing, the best music you've ever seen, but then it'll be followed by another musical number, and maybe that musical number is not quite as good, or the singing's not quite as good, or just doesn't quite hit all the right marks, and then you'll have another musical sequence. It's like, take a break, get back to the story, or just give us a couple seconds. Like, if you look at the wedding sequence from The Godfather, there'll be like a couple seconds of somebody singing a song, and it establishes the setting and the tone and the vibe, and then they cut back to Vito Corleone's kind of dungeon where he's doing business, and so you get the Italian music flavor, but it doesn't overwhelm the movie. With the Cotton Club, every time somebody starts playing a note on their trombone or on their saxophone or whatever, it's like, oh, well, now we got to see the entire song played in full, and it just makes the whole movie feel endless, and it makes those musical numbers feel excessive. And this is coming from somebody who loves the jazz music of this period. And as much as I might regard Duke Ellington as a god among insects, I mean, he's one of the greatest composers who's ever lived, I don't need to see people imitating Duke Ellington. I definitely don't want to see people imitating Cab Calloway. Cab Calloway is one of those actors or one of those performers where you can't imitate him. You either get the real deal from like the animated films he did in the 30s with Betty Boop, or appearing in the Blues Brothers. But like, there's a long sequence with Cab Calloway where I just kept thinking, well, you're not as good as Cab Calloway, so just cut this whole sequence. Or hiring two actors to try to impersonate the Nicholas brothers, which is just an impossible task. If you've ever seen Stormy Weather and you've seen the climax of that movie, it's probably the most godlike dance sequence in the history of movies, like, any era, any country. It's jaw-dropping, and I'm sorry, it's like hiring actors and saying, I need you to play basketball as well as Michael Jordan, or hiring actors and saying, I need you to box as well as Muhammad Ali. You just can't do it. And so, yeah, Coppola should have just had his own musicians and his own performers like that were unique to the movie performing, as opposed to trying to recapture the glories of the Nicholas brothers. But when it's good, it's great. Like, if you look at Nicolas Cage's death sequence, it's like, oh, that belongs within The Godfather 1 or The Godfather 2. Like, it's a really kick-ass death sequence. But when it's bad, it's kind of brutal to watch and kind of embarrassing. So it is a great movie, but it is a deeply flawed movie. But you don't have to be perfect to be a good movie. And once again, I'm ranking it number 8. And the Cotton Club Encore cut is very fresh in my mind. I don't know if it's a better idea to start with the Encore cut or the original theatrical cut. I didn't feel like the Encore cut was demonstrably better, but it's closer to Coppola's original vision. So if you're feeling charitable, just watch both back to back, and then you can do your own compare and contrast. Now, for my choice for my number 7, I expect I'll get the most pushback from my fellow Francis Ford Coppola enthusiasts, but I'm going to go with Rumblefish from 1983, which means obviously that I rank it behind The Outsiders, and that's going to be the big debate with any Coppola fan. With the year of 1983, we have the S.E. Hinton double feature. Susan Eloise Hinton, she was a novelist. She wrote The Outsiders when she was still a high school student. But as Coppola was shooting The Outsiders, he was working on the screenplay for Rumblefish with S.E. Hinton. It's just fascinating how he devoted so much time to kind of fleshing out the world and the characters of this author, and the two films could not be more different, even though you've got a lot of overlap in terms of the cast. Obviously, Matt Dillon, but Rumblefish is in black and white. It's a little more self-consciously arty. It's definitely more personal. I mean, you got the relationship of the two brothers between Matt Dillon and Mickey Rourke and their troubled history with their father, played by Dennis Hopper. And yeah, it feels a little bit more improvisational, definitely a little bit more kind of experimental theater and that sort of thing. But it's got a killer ensemble cast. I mean, you've got Lawrence Fishburne and Nicolas Cage and Tom Waits and Diane Lane. I mean, that alone makes it worth hunting down. But what I like about The Outsiders is that it's more of a story. It's definitely more of a kind of romantic story, almost like Romeo and Juliet, where you've got like the, the Capulets and the Montagues going to war. Instead, you got like the Socs and the Greasers and that sort of thing. And also, obviously, with The Outsiders, there's just no way for me to escape the influence that movie had over that entire decade. Like when I was a kid in the 1980s, I never heard of Rumblefish. But The Outsiders, like, it loomed large in all of our imaginations, which is probably why I favor it more. But I also think the Outsiders, it's just a more entertaining kind of commercial story, whereas Rumblefish is a more ambitious, more experimental film. So if you regard it as your favorite Coppola film, I would not be shocked, because I've definitely met people who hold Rumblefish in incredibly high regard. Just for me, there are times where it feels a little inauthentic, a little artificial, a little stagey, and that's all deliberate, but it keeps me from getting totally emotionally invested in the story, whereas with The Outsiders, I'm nothing but emotionally invested in the story. But if I had to zero in on some of my favorite stuff, I mean, watching Matt Dillon and Diane Lane, whether they're screaming at each other or making out or fighting or she's breaking up with them, whatever, like those two actors were born to work together. They're incredible in this, and they're incredible in The Outsiders, and it's very hard to find that level of chemistry, and you just really feel it. And it's just absolutely hilarious seeing the young Sofia Coppola trying to sit on the couch, and basically I guess Coppola's a big fan of cock-blocking scenes, because it's very reminiscent of the scene from The Rain People, where Robert Duvall's trying to get it on, but Matt Dillon's trying to get it on before he has a big fight later that night, and Sofia Coppola wants to hang out on the couch. But I guess another reason why I might not like this one as much, I don't like the music choices in Rumblefish nearly as much as the music choices in The Outsiders. And I know with The Outsiders, Coppola regarded it as so candy-coated, and it had so many like kind of romantic Gone with the Wind references, he wanted to wash the taste out of his mouth of The Outsiders with a movie that was, in every way, its stylistic opposite number with Rumblefish. So it's just a fascinating experiment seeing what Coppola was going through, where he was basically, it's like a classic scenario, make one for them and then one for yourself. But even if I don't necessarily like the music of Rumblefish nearly as much, I will give credit where credit is due, because this film is definitely much more overtly erotic than The Outsiders. Watching Matt Dillon in, like, whether he's in class or he's in shop class or whatever, he's always kind of looking up and like fantasizing about his girlfriend, like, hanging out on the bookshelf and that sort of thing. And anybody who's ever been a teenage boy can definitely relate to those emotions. Or there's a pretty wild, scandalous party at one point where Matt Dillon's cheating on Diane Lane, where, it's basically just a pile of bodies on a bed, and everybody's like pulling each other's clothes off and laughing and falling off, and it's just totally insane. So yeah, if you like your Coppola to be more personal and more artsy-fartsy, watch Rumblefish, and if you want it to be more romantic and accessible, watch The Outsiders. But The Outsiders is not my number 6. My number 6 is yet another choice where I'm expecting a lot of pushback, but I'm going to go with Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992, and the reason I'm placing it at number 6 is, I have to be honest, there's a chance I might have seen this movie more than any other movie directed by Francis Ford Coppola. And if some of you are thinking, you've seen Dracula more times than you've seen Godfather, I really don't know. I've seen them both a lot, but this movie came along at the perfect time where it just made my head explode, where I watched it over and over and over again. And actually, I saw this movie before reading Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is somewhere, there it is, on the bookshelf. And obviously we've seen a lot of movies with Dracula over the years, but this is the only movie that actually tries, more or less successfully, to adapt the format of the novel, where it's a series of journal entries and letters and phonograph recordings. And the movie doesn't like religiously adhere to that structure, but it does pay homage to that structure over and over and over again. Or the voyage of the Demeter, when Dracula's taking out all the sailors. For that alone, I think this movie deserves very high marks.
Vampires do exist. This one we fight, this one we face. Can take on many forms. He is both young and old.
And also, we have to keep in mind, this was a massive hit for Francis Ford Coppola. One of the reasons he was able to kind of get a career rejuvenation in the 90s was because of Dracula. It made piles of cash. And even though it's deeply flawed, like Keanu Reeves, I maybe the worst performance in movie history is Keanu Reeves as Jonathan Harker and Bram Stoker's Dracula. I mean, there are some lines where I just like physically flinch when I hear him. It's like, it's the Count. He's grown young. I mean, he's basically still trying to talk like Ted from Bill and Ted's, but with an English accent. I mean, it's terrible. And yeah, I have a hard time listening to American actors do English accents under any circumstances. But we also have Anthony Hopkins, not with an English accent, but doing the voice of Van Helsing. He also he's a priest early on, and he's the narrator of The Voyage of the Demeter. So we got a lot of Anthony Hopkins in here. But Anthony Hopkins isn't that good in this movie either. I think the main reason why I like this movie so much is because of Sadie Frost. I think this is the most erotic interpretation of a vampire that I've ever seen on screen, and there's a lot of very healthy competition on that front. And part of the enduring popularity of vampires has always been the libidinous elements of the interactions with vampires. Like, are you making out and making love, or are they feeding on you, are they killing you, are they making you a mate or a lifelong companion? Like, what's going on here? It gets very messy and very complicated. But I think with Sadie Frost, no actor or actress has ever expressed more like the orgasmic pleasure of being fed upon. Like, there's scenes where she is moaning in ecstasy, breasts exposed, writhing in her bed, and we're seeing like blood splattering across the floor as Dracula flees, as men rush in to try to help her with like blood transfusions and that sort of thing. But that stuff is just unhinged and insane. Or the scenes in the rain where she's walking around her palatial estate, or she and Winona Ryder are making out in the rain before Dracula in werewolf mode, has a full-blown sex scene with Sadie Frost, and just the way she kind of arches up. I mean, it's insane that this movie even got made. And of course, there's no getting around the fact that Monica Bellucci shows up with a couple of her other kind of like brides of Dracula. It looks like they're basically going to make love to / feed upon or just eat or rip apart Keanu Reeves. And he's saved at the last second by Dracula, who brings a newborn baby for those girls to feed on. But, oh my God, like that scene, it's a masterclass in erotic horror. And if you follow this channel for any period of time, you'll know that I think sex and scary movies go together very, very well. And I probably started feeling that way after seeing Bram Stoker's Dracula. Although, to be fair, Fright Night has one or two moments like that as well. And I did see Fright Night about 6 years prior, which probably set me on my path to loving the combination of horror films and eroticism. And I haven't even mentioned Gary Oldman, one of the greatest actors who's ever lived, where you want to talk about an actor being invested in a role. Jesus Christ, like the accent and his way of expressing himself and the way he articulates his words and his body posture. I mean, no actor has ever been more invested in a role than Gary Oldman as Dracula, as Vad Dracul. And I know that he and Coppola fought quite a bit. And it's a great documentary where Gary Oldman admits, like, I didn't even necessarily always believe in what I was arguing for. I just wanted to get my way from time to time. So it was a real wrestling match between Gary Oldman and Francis Ford Coppola. And you can see them fighting over just simple things like when he's walking down a hall and what line he should be saying as he walks past a certain threshold or doorway, whatever. Everything about their technique and their approach to acting, they were definitely at loggerheads, but the end result is one of the biggest hits of Francis Ford Coppola's career. And Coppola says that one of the secrets to the success of the movie was that he had an entire week of rehearsal with this cast. Coppola's recognized the value of this for a long time, but before you shoot a movie, get the actors together, let them read the text over and over and over again, let them just be in character and just get used to each other, like on The Godfather. He got the entire cast together, and they just got to act like a family for a long time before they started shooting, so that when they started shooting, those family vibes were already there, and it just feels so authentic and so believable. And he kept that, whether he's working on a trashy horror movie like Bram Stoker's Dracula or a trashy gangster movie like The Godfather, he elevates the trashy material to higher levels. And yeah, no one will ever criticize Coppola for not being good at working with his actors, even if Keanu Reeves, just due to his star power, was horribly miscast in this film. But in a weird way, his trashy performance or his horrible performance kind of makes me like the movie even more. Like, you need a few imperfections in a work of art to make you like it. But let's move on to my number 5, The Outsiders from 1983. And before I started doing my research for this video, I ranked all the movies by Coppola that I had seen, and The Outsiders was not ranked as highly as it is now, but I revisited the original cut, and then I saw the, what's it called, like the novel cut? Yeah, The Outsiders, the complete novel. A quick shout out to my friend Tony Stella, who did the art for the Blu-ray. And if you're not familiar with the work of Tony Stella, not only does he know his shit when it comes to film history, he's just a jaw-dropping artist when it comes to capturing kind kind of what is the essence of a particular movie, and then expressing it as a movie poster. And Jesus Christ, yeah, the new version of The Outsiders, the complete novel cut, I don't like it as much as the original cut, but what it does have is a major new opening scene, which is just an absolute jewel where you get to see all the outsiders interacting. Ponyboy's coming home, some socialists try to beat him up, and suddenly Emilio Estevez and Tom Cruise and Rob Lowe and they're rushing in to the rescue. And I always felt like Rob Lowe and Tom Cruise. Basically, there are a lot of members of The Outsiders who don't get as much screen time. Or Patrick Swayze, they don't get as much screen time as obviously Matt Dillon, Ralph Macchio, and C. Thomas Howell. But at least with this new cut, we get one more big kick-ass action scene where we see the socials and the greasers throwing down. But I do prefer the original cut of The Outsiders just because I've seen it so many goddamn times. And I know that Coppola resents the fact that now he basically tried to have like some Gone with the Wind homages in the movie, because a big part of the movie is Ponyboy and Johnny in hiding, just hanging out and reading sections of Gone with the Wind and making comparisons how Matt Dillon's character, he's gallant like a lot of the soldiers who were dying in that story. And so you have a few sequences throughout the movie where they're trying to recreate the look of Gone with the Wind from 1939. And I guess my biggest reason for preferring the original version over the new version, there's a crucial scene near the end of the movie where Diane Lane's character, Cherry, shows up to explain how the socialists have agreed to leave the weapons at home. The big rumble, the big brawl between the socialists and the greasers is going to be skin on skin, fist on fist. And she's there just to say they're going to obey the rules. They're going to come to the place at the designated time. But in the original version, you've got that kind of Gone with the Wind music. In the new version, you've got rock and roll music, which might have worked. But in the new version, they've cranked up the music to such a loud degree, you can't hear her dialogue. And so the emotion of the scene between her and C. Thomas Howell, which might be the sweetest scene of the movie, where he says,
"Can you see the sunset from the south side very good?
Yeah, real good.
You can see it from the north side too."
But just to wrap things up on this movie, it's got more heart and more character and more humanity and more great character beats than 100 other Hollywood movies from this period put together. And when you look at the cast, it's like Ralph Macchio went on to do The Karate Kid, and Patrick Swayze went on to do Dirty Dancing, and Tom Cruise went on to do everything that Tom Cruise has done, and obviously Matt Dillon and Emilio Estevez and Rob Lowe. I mean, everybody had incredible careers coming out of this movie, or Diane Lane even. And it just blows my mind that Coppola had such a great eye for talent and identifying who were going to be the future superstars, or even if he didn't know they're going to be superstars, just recognizing they're going to bring to the table some ingredients. And a lot of them, they have horrible, atrocious accents in this. It doesn't even matter. Like, the emotions are so pure that I can disregard the accents. But let's move on now to my top 4. And going into this video, I knew which movies were going to be my top 4. But the only question was, in which order do I want to do those 4? And I've decided to go with Apocalypse Now for my number 4. And even though I love Apocalypse Now, and I've seen it many times, like my friends in college, whenever we wanted to test a new screen or new speakers, or just basically how good is someone's entertainment system, we would plug in my Laserdisc of Apocalypse Now, which at that time had this digital sound called AC3, which in 1996 was a big deal. But it was basically just digital surround sound. But if you wanted to really put like your system to the test, you had to put in the Apocalypse Now Laserdisc and really like listen to Walter Murch's sound and just listen to all those little subtle details. And I do think it is one of the great movies of Coppola's career. But my problem is the same problem that most people have. It doesn't have much of an ending. And I feel like John Milius' script had an ending. The novel Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad has an ending. And Coppola has an ending that he basically improvised his way to with Marlon Brando and Dennis Hopper. But I just don't find the ending as satisfying as the rest of the movie. And I think the ending works. I won't go so far as to say the ending doesn't work. It's just not as good as everything that comes before. And without going into too much detail, watch Hearts of Darkness, A Filmmaker's Apocalypse, and you'll see how Marlon Brando basically showed up horribly overweight, having not read the novel. And this was already after he had threatened to leave the production, even though he'd been paid $1 million advance by Coppola. Toward the end of his life, Marlon Brando got incredibly difficult to work with. But Coppola was willing to wrestle with that tiger if he could get the right the ingredients on screen. But while he's already horribly over schedule and already horribly over budget, he's got Brando, who's insisting upon having long conversations every day about the script and about the book. The clock was running, and Coppola was at the same time feeling this enormous pressure where he devoted so many years of his life to this project, and he had so many conflicted feelings about how he wanted to portray the Vietnam War and what conclusion he wanted to draw about the Vietnam War. And at the same time, he's got an actor who's refusing to learn his lines or deliver his lines. And so finally he realized, well, if I can just get some great scenes of great dramatic power where he and Dennis Hopper are improvising, then maybe I can kind of backdoor my way into some sort of profound ending that will be a suitable ending for all the other ingredients that are already at play. And it just is it's kind of a fascinating catastrophe to watch unfold. But one of my favorite stories about the making of Apocalypse Now is how after all the storms and heart attacks and budget overruns and just catastrophes that were besetting this production, or the local army that was supposed to provide helicopters and whatnot, they're always flying away to fight the rebels. I mean, everything that could go wrong in Apocalypse Now did go wrong. But one of my favorite chapters is when John Milius is brought in to try to help save the movie or fix the movie by helping Coppola lock down an ending. And John Milius talks about how he went into the Coppola's office to kind of give him a stern talking to help him get things organized again. And when he came out of the office like 90 minutes later, it's like, not only is he on the right track, but he's a genius. And I totally believe, like, he was laughing about how Coppola's powers of persuasion were such that he was able to convince the person brought in to fix the movie that he wrote in the first place, and how he was able to kind of get him on board with his mad vision. And I get it. If you listen to Coppola's commentary tracks, they have that effect on you where just the way he speaks and the way he expresses himself, you find yourself wanting to agree with him and wanting to see things from his point of view, even if you disagree at the outset. But Apocalypse Now, it's a rock and roll war movie. It's got so many incredible things. And when talking about the things that work, I'm going to give you the same details or the same scenes that everybody else does. Like, everybody likes watching Robert Duvall in that helicopter scene, flying in, taking out the village so that he can hold that point so some people can go surfing while Martin Sheen and his crew are able to continue on their journey up the river. I mean, it's the most operatic action scene probably in the history of movies in terms of the way that it's shot, the way that it's staged, the way you get to see Coppola himself in the scene, like, good, just keep going, like you're fighting.
Go on, it's for television. Don't look at the camera. Don't look at the camera. Just go by like you're fighting. Like you're fighting. Don't look at the camera. It's for television. Just go through.
It's fucking awesome. But I love so much about this movie. What I don't like is Apocalypse Now Redux. And my biggest complaint about Apocalypse Now Redux is that there are certain scenes that introduce light humor that let you exhale. And whether you're reading Heart of Darkness or watching Apocalypse Now, the theatrical cut, it should always get darker until you get to the Heart of Darkness, and then it ends. And I feel like it was a mistake to have the scene, even though I love nude scenes in movies, it was a mistake in the Apocalypse Now Redux to have the actors interacting with Playboy bunnies after they've saved them. And I think it was a mistake to have the French plantation, because it allows everybody to sleep on clean sheets and that sort of thing. Anything that breaks that internal tension of getting progressively darker, I think is a mistake. And maybe it's just a situation where I've seen the Apocalypse Now theatrical cut so many times, I can't watch any other cut other than that, but your mileage may vary. But in the end, it's all about just the tone, the style, the atmosphere. Between the photography by Vittorio Storaro and the doors and the operatic music by Wagner and this incredible ensemble cast and that brilliant voiceover narration that was added after the fact. I've said it like 3 times so far, but you must read this book to get the full story of the making of Apocalypse Now, and just having scenes of like Coppola curled up on the floor screaming at Eleanor like, I don't know what the ending of this movie is. I don't know. I never knew what the ending was. I'm a fraud. I'm a charlatan. Like,
nothing is so terrible as a pretentious movie. I mean, a movie that aspires for something really terrific and doesn't pull it off is shit. It's scum. And everyone will walk on it as such. And that's why poor filmmakers, in a way, that's their greatest horror, is to be pretentious.
But let's push on to my top 3. And no matter what order I do these in, I was going to be a little unsatisfied, but I'm going to go with Godfather Part II from a number 3 from 1974. And I say this, I'm one of those guys where from about age 20 to about age 40, I said not only was The Godfather Part II better than The Godfather, that I thought it might be the greatest movie made in America ever. I've got a lot of love and affection for Godfather Part II. However, as I've gotten mean and cranky in my old age, there's something about the pacing and the romanticism and basically the page-turner qualities of the first Godfather that makes it rank higher in my opinion. And if you listen to his commentary, you'll hear Coppola talking about how, at this point in the movie, the inherent page-turner essence of the novel is taking over the structure of the movie, giving it that sense of rhythm and that sense of momentum. And I think that rhythm and that sense of momentum is largely absent from The Godfather Part II. It's 3 hours and 20 minutes with an intermission. I mean, it's classy as fuck. And there are scenes like when Robert De Niro is walking along the rooftops in Little Italy, and who is it he's about to kill? It's the Black Hand. What the hell is the Black Hand's name? Don Fanucci is the name that I was struggling to remember, but all that stuff. I mean, I live relatively close to the intersection of Elizabeth Street and Prince, which is kind of the northern edge of Little Italy, or at least as what little of Little Italy remains. But it's like you're walking through that neighborhood, it's like, oh, there's the church that was the interior for the baptism scene from The Godfather. Oh, like that's Martin Scorsese's birthplace right there. Like when you walk through that neighborhood, it's like you're experiencing film history in real time, but also you can just see The Godfather Part II, and you can hear that music, and just that's Coppola at his most beautiful. Just seeing Robert De Niro in like Angel of Death mode, going down to the building, taking out Don Fanucci. It's so goddamn cool. And I love seeing all the scenes with like the young Clemenza and the young Tessio. It makes Tessio's betrayal in the first movie all the more impactful when you see the young version of Tessio and realize, oh my God, like Tessio, he was there from like the early days when Vito was a very, very young man. And of course, all the scenes in Havana are fucking incredible. Like they're right on the verge of Castro taking over, and you have all these businessmen that are living in total denial about what is about to go down. Which leads me, obviously, to Lee Strasberg as Hyman Roth is just pitch-perfect casting.
How do you feel?
Terrible. I'd give $4 million just to be able to take a piss without it hurting.
And I think sometimes people overlook just how dark and just how powerful this movie is. Just seeing the lengths to which this family will go to achieve their goals. Like the scene where a senator wakes up in a whorehouse thinking that he's murdered the girl that he's with, and it's all a way of just making sure that he's not going to provide as much resistance to the Corleone family as they relocate to Nevada. Just seeing the lengths they'll go to. And obviously, Michael, holy crap. Like, Michael is so charismatic and he's so brilliant that it's easy to overlook the fact that he murders or has his brother murdered in this, and he waits for his mother to die to do it so that he won't break her heart. And just seeing that scene where Al Pacino is hugging John Cazale, he raises his head and he looks right at Al, and he just, I think he even does like a little nod, but you know, or maybe it's Al who nods back, but you know, oh my God, there he is. He's hugging Fredo. Fredo's so sweet and helpless, as their sister says, and he's just doomed to get shot in the back of the head while saying his Hail Marys out on the lake. And those final scenes of Michael just like in that living room in the darkness where he's just totally alone, or sitting outside with the gray in his hair, where you see how he's done so much. He's tried to be strong for his family for so long, but he's lost his wife, and she's aborted one of their children, and like everything he was fighting for is kind of slipping through his fingers. And it just makes me wonder, would The Godfather and The Godfather Part II be even more highly regarded if The Godfather Part III had never been made? I mean, The Godfather 1 and 2 are already two of the most beloved movies ever made. But is it possible they would be regarded even greater than like Casablanca and Lawrence of Arabia and all these other movies that they always get mentioned alongside? But it is one of the quintessential American movies about business and about family and about kind of the darkness at the core of everything this family has tried to achieve. We love these characters so intensely, and we admire them so much, and we want to be around them so much, but we do need to remember sometimes they do kill a lot of people, or they've got a lot of buttons who work with a buffer. Like that, one of the best lines in movie history. Yeah, the family had a lot of buffers.
Right, yeah, buffer. The family had a lot of buffers.
I mean, I just howl every time. Like, it does have some levity where I just crack up watching this movie, but it is a pretty relentless, grim, dark experience. And so that is why I regard The Godfather now as the superior of the movie, because it's a little shorter and just a little bit more entertaining. And also you have the complete cast, whereas then obviously in The Godfather Part II, you're starting to lose some of the cast members. And fucking Marlon Brando, they needed him for that final scene. There was some disagreement between him and Paramount, so he was not there for the final scene. But at least we got to see James Caan back in action. When you see Fredo and Sonny, Tom and Michael all just sitting there, like that is the essence of the Godfather saga.
Break your father's heart on his birthday.
Yeah, that's swell, Mike. Congratulations.
That's right, encouraging.
I'm going to start crying if I start talking about it too much, so let's just push on to my number 2, The Conversation from 1974. So when I put up my little notice on YouTube and my little notice on Twitter saying like, what are the like what are the films by Coppola that deserve more love and recognition? The Conversation came up quite a bit alongside Rumblefish, but I feel like The Conversation is one of those movies, maybe just because I was taught it in college. I feel like this is one of those movies that's had its due. And I just realized I forgot to bring my Blu-ray in for show and tell, so I'll be right back. All right. Here's one of my latest additions to my physical library, and I bought this knowing full well there's another version of it coming out like in a few short months where I will buy it again. But this is going to sound very pretentious to say, but this might be the only movie in Coppola's filmography where I feel like if you've only seen it once, I don't want to hear you say a goddamn word about it. You have to see this movie twice, and you have to see it twice sitting up, drinking your coffee, and paying attention. And I know a lot of people might say, well, movies are supposed to be entertaining. I want it just to wash over me. I want it to take me on a journey. And that's fine. But if you want that experience, watch The Godfather. But if you want to see a deeply personal movie that remains incredibly mysterious, The Conversation is just a goddamn fucking masterpiece. And the first time I saw it, I was forced to watch it for a class, and then I had to watch it again for my final exam. And it was starting to get its hooks into me there, and then I kept coming back to it. And every time you come back to this movie, it's astonishing how you can see it with completely fresh eyes, where all the kind of the technique and all the skills and all the craftsmanship of the central character, Harry Call, played by Gene Hackman, how you almost start to kind of see the movie with fresh eyes, knowing all the skills and tactics that he used to record that first conversation. And I think it's probably Coppola's most successful experimental movie, but also his most interesting character study, because Harry Call has all these like bizarre contradictions. Like he's the absolute heavyweight champion of poking his nose into somebody else's life and hearing their conversations, and yet he falls for simple gags or simple tricks like having a pen placed in his pocket to record him when he's at his most vulnerable and his most intimate, and how he's got, I don't want to like ruin the movie or go too deep into the weeds, but he's somebody who's completely internalized his entire life, and yet when he has a dream about the woman that he's been following, he just starts confessing everything about his own personal life. And that's when we start getting some details about Coppola's life. Coppola spent a lot of his childhood like basically suffering for like one leg and one arm was almost completely paralyzed, and then he slowly but surely got kind of rehabbed back into being like a fully functional person. But a lot of times people will talk about with the work of art where the form of the work of art must follow its function, and I feel like that line applies very directly to The Conversation, where the techniques being used by the characters in the movie are also some of the techniques being used by the filmmakers. And it just like the film contains all these like these multitudes that just start to explode each time you revisit the movie. But also it's just got good old-fashioned pure raw entertainment value. Like Harrison Ford is incredible in this movie, and at one point he's expecting all these basically all these surveillance tapes to be turned over to him, and because Hackman's character is so specific about wanting to turn them over to Duvall, they get in this little tug of war over the recording, and it's incredible. Or just hearing John Cazelle's ongoing commentary about The Conversation, about a murder that's about to take place, and you hear John Cazelle just saying, "What a stupid conversation." And I'm sure there are a lot of people who don't like this movie when they see it, and they're like, yeah, like you said it perfectly. That's precisely how I'm feeling. And I'll say that if you felt that way the first time you saw it, maybe you were right, maybe you were wrong, but I think if you are a Coppola fan, you owe it to yourself to go back and watch this again. It's basically like it's in this weird family tree of movies like Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up, as well as Brian De Palma's Blow Out. And I know a lot of people will, depending on which they see first, they won't like the other two that they see, where basically an artist, through their technique, is trying to get to the heart of a potential murder. And a lot of people like Blow Out the most. A lot of people like The Conversation the most. And a lot of people like Blow Up the most. And my attitude is Antonioni, De Palma, and Coppola all made brilliant movies, and they're all worthwhile, or they're all worth seeing. I think my favorite of the three, though, is The Conversation. Maybe that's just because it has a piano score that absolutely belongs in the Hall of Fame. That piano score, oh my God, it just pulls me through the movie, and it really just gets me every single time. This is also one of the movies where Coppola started getting a lot of festival love. He's one of the few directors who's won the Golden Palm or the Palme d'Or twice at the Cannes Film Festival. I don't know if Megalopolis will be his third, or I think he's only won twice, this and Apocalypse Now, but I just find it fascinating how after the horror of the experience of making The Godfather, like it's easy to look at The Godfather, oh, they made a hit movie, I'm sure he had a wonderful, beautiful time making The Godfather, when the precise opposite was true. But after the success of The Godfather, he used that to immediately dive into making one of his most personal films. And I think it's one of the most mysterious and one of the most inviting and one of the most perplexing and thought-provoking movies ever to come out of like a big studio or by a mainstream director in Hollywood. And it's one of the many reasons why the 1970s is the best decade of filmmaking in Hollywood. But before my voice completely gives out, we have one final movie on this list that we need to discuss. It's a little-known, obscure indie movie you might have heard of, and it's called The Godfather, and it changed movies for all time. Now, The Godfather can be a little intimidating to discuss because what can you say about The Godfather that has not already been said? And I don't want to just regurgitate things that I've heard from other people expressing it more eloquently, but I guess what keeps me coming back to The Godfather is that it's the perfect example of a movie where it's both a blockbuster, crowd-pleasing piece of entertainment as well as an enduring work of art. And basically that just means it's a classic. And I feel like you need to have a little bit of both. You need to have the artistry, but you also need to have the entertainment value for a movie to stick around for a long time. This is one of several movies which absolutely defined the 1970s. Like if you look at the big hits of the 1970s, you've got The Godfather, you've got The Exorcist, you've got The French Connection, you've got obviously Jaws, and you've got Star Wars and Rocky and all these movies. But I feel like the blockbuster era of the 1970s really got kickstarted by The Godfather. And it won a ton of Academy Awards and Golden Globes, even won a Grammy, and the sequel won even more awards. And up until about 2007, AFI was ranking it number 2 behind Citizen Kane, and it's interesting how there was a debate or dispute between Francis Ford Coppola and his DP Gordon Willis on this, where during the scene where Vito Corleone gets shot, Coppola wanted a shot of the camera looking down with all these oranges spilling out on the road, and Gordon Willis, who's a real purist about structure, and basically every shot needs to be from a point of view of like the audience or the characters, and he pushed back and said, well, whose point of view is that angle? And Coppola had this great line where he said, it's my point of view. It's Orson Welles' point of view. Because like many people of that period, Coppola really looked up to Citizen Kane. Like if you look at Coppola and Friedkin and all these directors from the late 60s, early 70s, they worship Citizen Kane, and I worship it as well. But I understand a lot of young people are less into it. But I would just say, give it a second try. You never know. Citizen Kane might suck you in and place you under its spell. But I love how Coppola in 1972 was starting to get enough confidence where he could say, it's my point of view, it's Orson Welles' point of view. But goddamn, he got pushed around quite a bit on this movie because he had no power. He had no leverage. When he was originally hired on this movie, it's because he was Italian or Italian-American. And basically, Robert Evans, the producer, wanted you to be able to smell the spaghetti while watching this. And during that scene where Clemenza's teaching Michael how to cook and like pushing in his sausages and that sort of thing.
You see, you start out with a little bit of oil. And you fry some garlic. Then you throw in some tomatoes, some tomato paste. You fry it. You make sure it doesn't stick. You got it to a boil. You shove in all your sausage and your meatballs.
You do smell the spaghetti. An interesting footnote about that scene. When Coppola adapted the novel, Mario Puzo went back over the script and made some changes because Coppola in that scene had said, now you need to brown your sausages before putting them in. And Puzo told Coppola, look, these are gangsters. Gangsters don't brown their sausage. They fry their sausage. And so it just seems like Coppola and Puzo had a wonderful, warm collaboration, and Coppola just said Puzo was like one of the nicest human beings to work with imaginable, and they just, between the two of them, they created this genuine fucking epic. And it's so interesting hearing now, like, which scenes were shot in which order and which scenes were added later. Like, one of the best scenes by far, Al Pacino and Marlon Brando sitting side by side. They hadn't really thought of that scene or even considered doing that scene, and so they brought in Robert Towne to write that scene. Like, you would think, oh, this is like the Mario Puzo Godfather experience, but here we have Robert Towne making contributions to the script. So it just shows how Coppola was a true genius of like taking a little bit of genius from here and a little bit of genius from there. Or was it Dean Tovallaris? So who was the name of his production designer? But basically taking the best of all of his cast and all of his crew and putting it into the movie. And of course, actors being actors, on the premiere of The Godfather, James Caan apparently pulled Robert Evans aside and said, you cut my whole fucking part out. Anyway, there's so much to be learned about The Godfather from Robert Evans' book, The Kid Stays in the Picture, and there's obviously a lot to be learned about The Godfather here as well. But I think the best way to do it is like watch the documentaries and all the Blu-rays and DVDs and YouTube and whatnot, listen to the commentary, read the book, and just watch the movie over and over and over. I don't think any time invested in studying The Godfather, enjoying The Godfather, from any angle is ever time wasted.
This wasn't enough time, Michael. Wasn't enough time. We'll get there, Pop. We'll get there.
And the fact that they shot this movie in only 62 days is just astonishing. I mean, Apocalypse Now shot for well over 200 days, but 62 days. And I just feel like, I mean, there's so many scenes in this movie you could say, oh, that might be the greatest scene in movie history. And obviously, at the top of the list is going to be the baptism scene. And that baptism scene, it was not written like that in the novel. It was created in the editing room. And like when you're telling a story, obviously, the novel is the first draft. And then the screenplay is the next draft. And the shoot's the next draft. And as you're editing it, it's draft after draft after draft. But they were unable to get that scene to work, to the degree that they would like. When you got young Sofia Coppola playing the son of Connie in there, as Michael's going through, all these lines like about renouncing Satan and that sort of thing. But they couldn't figure out how to make the scene work. But they finally realized, let's just add a little organ music, like an organ like from a church. And suddenly, all those shotgun blasts and assassinations, and it all comes together so beautifully when you hear like the organ kind of like revving up.
Do you renounce Satan?
I do renounce him.
Like Mo Green's getting shot in the eye. That is the essence of movies. Movies don't get more powerful. Movies don't get more transportive. The technique of movies they don't get more sophisticated, and just movies don't become more awe-inspiring than what you see in that scene. And if you've seen the movie a million times, it's easy to kind of disregard it. It's like, oh, obviously that scene's great. But I think we just need to remember why was The Godfather so special and so intense. And it's because it was giving us scenes unlike anything we'd ever seen in movies before. And even when Coppola was working under all this pressure and constantly being threatened with being fired, and even like being like betrayed by some crew members on the production who were kind of working for the brass as opposed to working for him, and Coppola slowly but surely, almost like the Godfather himself, figured out who they were and fired them and got rid of them. But he always found time to add a little authenticity, a few details like the cannoli. One of the most famous lines in the entire movie is when Clemenza says,
"Leave the gun. Take the cannoli."
And earlier, when we see like him starting his day and leaving the house, Coppola told the wife, say, "Oh, just as he's walking out, say something like, and don't forget the cannoli." Because when Coppola was a little boy, his father's a special treat sometimes would bring him cannolis to give to the kids, and they always loved it. But it's a little taste of the Italian-American experience that Coppola was able to bring to the movie. And obviously, Coppola did not grow up in a family of organized crime. And his father is a musician and a composer. He had a very different upbringing. But all the Italian flavor, it's what makes this the great American movie. Like oftentimes writers talk about wanting to write the great American novel. And when you talk about the great American novel, different people mean different things. But when I think about the Corleone family, a family of immigrants, Vito arrives fresh off the boat, takes the name of his hometown as his last name, and from nothing builds an empire, has all these kids, and then passes that empire on, and then we see how the empire or the dream kind of becomes a nightmare by the end of The Godfather Part II. But that saga, it's like a microcosm of the American experience in terms of coming to this country with dreams and ambitions and becoming a titan of industry. But also just, as Coppola said himself, this is a movie about a family, made by a family, and I don't know if we've ever seen a more compelling portrayal of a family on screen. This whole movie, in a lot of ways, it kind of captures the soul of the American experience or the New York experience. And if aliens were to land on this planet tomorrow and say, what are movies? Give us movies. I might just say, well, watch The Godfather and Godfather Part II. That is movies. Like, does it capture everything about movies? No. But it captures enough, which is yet another reason why I say Coppola is the greatest director of this decade. Even if I might like individual movies by some of his peers and rivals more, nobody did a better job of kind of defining and exemplifying what Hollywood in the 70s was all about, what the movie business was all about. He is like, this is the great story in filmmaking over the last half century or more. And even if I prefer the careers of filmmakers like Stanley Kubrick, or Orson Welles, or Howard Hawks, or Sam Peckinpah. Like, there are a lot of directors out there that I really intensely admire. But this is a story and a career that is just inexhaustible in terms of just how fascinating it is. Like, just this morning, I learned that one of my favorite sequences in The Godfather was kind of put together at the last minute with the help of George Lucas. There's a scene in this movie which is a montage of all these killings going back and forth between all these crime figures. And had this beautiful piano music playing throughout it in the background, and the piano's kind of slightly out of key, which makes it all the more haunting. But the musician playing the piano, I learned, is Carmine Coppola, Coppola's father, and I've always loved and adored that music. I find it incredible, and I can't remember if it was like a variation on a theme that he wrote or if it was an original composition. But George Lucas, working side by side with Coppola, helped him edit that sequence and shoot additional footage. And it's like, goddamn, even when you're under the gun and constantly being threatened with being fired and under all this pressure, you find a way to make this magical sequence that just feels so personal and so unique. And yeah, The Godfather, I don't know how many times I've seen it, but I hope that between now and when I meet my maker, I will have seen it just as many more times and hopefully helped more people discover it, more people see it for the first time. And if people have made it this far in this video and I've managed to persuade you to watch The Godfather for the first time, well then I can drop this microphone and walk away, mission accomplished. But I think that's all I've got to say for this video. I'm already past the 2-hour mark in terms of raw video that I've recorded. I don't know how short it'll be once I've managed to condense it and cut it all together, but it won't be 2 hours. But the good news is, with all my conversations or all my future conversations about Coppola for the rest of the year related to Megalopolis, like all my homework's been finished. I've watched the documentaries, I've read the books, I've seen the movies. Now I'm ready to rock. And so I will be returning to the subject of Coppola many more times throughout the rest of the year. But if you stuck with me this long, you have my gratitude and you have my thanks. I hope I gave you something to think about. I hope I gave you some interesting suggestions. And if you disagree with my top 10 or my top 23 and want to rearrange it, feel free to write your own rankings down in the comments below. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, sharing the video with your friends. I would greatly appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.